Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Elizabeth Henry, the president of the Environmental League of Massachusetts. ELM is a 122-year-old environmental advocacy organization based on Beacon Hill, and we've been advocating for Massachusetts to lead the nation in responsible environmental policy since 1898. I'm really delighted to welcome our hundreds of registrants joining us by Zoom and those of you who are watching this on Facebook Live. You include policymakers, business people, environmental advocates, social justice leaders, parents, grandparents, teachers, and students. And we're also pleased to have so many employees of our ELM Corporate Council member companies joining us today. So welcome to ELM's Earth Month webinar series. It's called Climate And. In these 4 sessions, we discuss intersectional climate issues with a diverse array of thought leaders. We'll explore how Massachusetts can fight the climate crisis while building a healthy, green, just, and prosperous future for the people of the Commonwealth. If you missed last week's webinar on climate and health, it's available on ELM's YouTube and Facebook pages. The upcoming topics for the following Thursdays in April are climate and equity and climate and economy. Today's webinar will cover climate and clean energy. It's moderated by Bobbi Kates-Garnick. Bobbi has been a terrific friend and advisor through her work at the ELM Corporate Council member Tufts University and over her long career in the public and private sectors. Bobbi will lead a conversation with the Massachusetts Undersecretary Judy Chang, Dr. Emily Reichert, and Ken Kimmel. You are welcome at any time to submit questions for the panelists in the Q&A box below and give a thumbs up to the questions that you most want to hear answered. This webinar will also be recorded, captioned, and made available on ELM's YouTube channel after the session. This panel is made possible through the generous support of ELM Corporate Council member Avangrid. And I now have the real privilege of turning it over to Avangrid's new CEO, Dennis Arriola. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, Elizabeth and ELM for including Avangrid and for me in this really important discussion. And I want to thank in advance the panelists for participating today. I'm looking forward to hearing your comments. You know, at Avangrid, we really are proud to be a sponsor of this event. And again, I want to listen, but I also want to learn from the panelists because there's so much going on in this environment regarding climate and energy. And so I'm going to keep my remarks short. But sustainability and clean energy are really in our DNA at Avangrid. We have a bold aspiration at our company. We want to become the leading sustainable energy company in the US. Bold, yes. Achievable? We think so. We're going to do this by growing our already strong footprint. So when it comes to clean energy, Avangrid is already the 3rd largest renewable operator in the United States, both with wind and solar onshore. We're in 22 different states, and we expect to grow our portfolio of clean energy generation by nearly 2/3 over the next 5 years. And we're connected to, and we deliver energy to, both in the form of electricity and natural gas, to about 3.3 million customers in Connecticut, New York, Maine, and obviously Massachusetts. We're also in the process of receiving approvals to merge with a company called PNM Resources, where we're going to be delivering electricity to another 800,000 customers in New Mexico and Texas. So at Avangrid, we're building our future on a sustainable business model and strategy that's really centered around ESG and F. That's stewardship around the environment, society, how we govern our company, but also financial performance. And we're expanding our growth through our investments in new, cleaner energy technologies. And we're pioneering the really exciting and nascent offshore wind industry here in the United States. And we're going to be delivering energy once again to Massachusetts. So we're really excited about that. In fact, over the next 5 years, we're going to be investing over $20 billion in infrastructure that's going to support clean energy solutions, grid resiliency, and new technologies. And we're already leading the way with the 2 of the biggest clean energy projects in New England that directly benefit Massachusetts. That's the New England Clean Energy Connect transmission line that's going to bring clean hydropower from Canada into New England and Massachusetts. And Vineyard Wind, the first large-scale offshore wind project ever constructed in the US. We're waiting for the last final approval here. So these projects are key. We're excited about them at Avangrid, and they're going to be a huge boost for our local economies, both from an economic standpoint and from an energy mix standpoint. I really believe that environmental, business, energy groups can and must work together on grid modernization in the same way that we all work together to develop a new offshore wind industry in the US. that's with rational policies and a spirit of collaboration. And so I think the panel that we have here today is going to talk about those important factors. And we really at Avangrid look forward to engaging with the ELM and the other stakeholders on that effort. And so again, we appreciate our inclusion as a sponsor, and I'm going to hand it over to Bobbi Kates-Garnick so we can get to the real stars of this panel.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Elizabeth. It is truly an honor to be part of this very august panel and talk about intersectionality. I don't think I've ever seen a panel where so many of the panelists have worn many different hats over their careers. So the perspectives will be really good to hear. So I'm going to kick it off. We're going to start with Undersecretary Judy Chang. Then we're going to go to Ken Kimmel, who has also worn many hats. And then finally to Dr. Emily Reichert, who's going to talk to us about innovation and work at Greentown Labs. So I'm going to start. All of you can respond the questions and answers. And as we go through the panel, hopefully we can answer as many questions as possible. If we don't get to your question, I think that ELM will be able to send them to us and we can respond as well. So my first question is to Undersecretary Judy Chang, who has a huge portfolio and many activities that she's overseeing. She is working on a 2050 roadmap. She is working to implement climate legislation. She has been involved in transportation on the TCI and bringing us electric vehicles. All of the issues that Dennis talked about, regional transmission, offshore wind, and then the role of natural gas. So many opportunities, so many challenges. Undersecretary, what do you see as the linkages and priorities among these issues? And how, in all of this vast portfolio, does Massachusetts maintain its role as a leader both in New England and then also nationally, because the country does look to Massachusetts?
Thank you so much. I'm also quite honored to be here today, and thank you for that all-encompassing question. And so I'll just start by answering the question about the intersection and the linkages. I think you're absolutely right that we have a significant amount of work ahead of us, significant amount of opportunities and challenges. The linkages really reside with how we think about decarbonization and how the pieces of the puzzle come together. And at a very high level, I think where the linkages are is reliability of all of our energy and climate systems, costs, because we care about not only costs for individuals and businesses, but really how the distribution or the significant impact on low-income communities would be. And then third, which is something hopefully we'll get more questions and answers about this, is the challenge of wanting and needing clean energy and the desire to have clean energy and the need for clean energy and the desire to protect our communities, our environment, and to minimize the impact of building infrastructure when we have to live and in this world where we want to make sure that the cost impact and the environmental impact are minimized. So I want to just spend a couple minutes to give you a little more background on the things that you just said that we are working on, and I think it'll be important to put that into context of what these linkages are. So in the last decades, and you asked about leadership, it has really been a really exciting time, particularly in these last couple of years. It started last year, Massachusetts declared with the governor setting an aggressive target for Massachusetts to achieve net zero emission by 2050. This target, of course, was consistent, is consistent with where the science says we need to be, but it is an ambitious target, and we know that we need to use really all the policy tools and all of the engagement we want to have with communities. Then we took on a comprehensive roadmap analysis. It actually was 2 years worth of work looking at how we achieve such a net zero in 2050. It's really required significant amount of effort to conduct a scientific based analysis about the different pathways that we might choose to take to reach the net zero. And then last month, the governor signed a new climate legislation that codifies the law to reach net zero by 2050. It's called an act creating a new generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy. And it establishes new interim goals. So we can't just say we're going to reach net zero in 2050, but exactly what are we going to do in this decade and the next decade? And this has significant implication to certainly my work, but really the work of everybody involved here on this panel and in the audience. So I want to talk a little bit about the roadmap study. I know many of the participants here, I can see many familiar names. You're familiar quite a bit with the roadmap study, but I want to just highlight a few things. By the way, if you haven't reviewed it, it is on our website, EEA's website, and it has a tremendous amount of material, included in the appendices, and I really encourage you to take a glance at it. But generally speaking, there are 4 main takeaways from that study. We analyzed multiple pathways, and while we want to keep our options open, we also found some most cost-effective, low-risk pathways. And this talking about linkages, this is where we link our economy to our clean energy systems. One, we need a balanced clean energy portfolio, and much of that is anchored on significant amount of offshore wind development and resources. And as you know, the new legislation gave approval for us to procure additional offshore wind resources. Second, we need transmission, and I will say optimized transmission, to allow us to access to diversified resources, renewable generation across the New England and possibly even across inter-region from other neighboring regions, as well as from Canada. And then third, once we clean up our electricity grid, we need to electrify our transportation and building heat. And I know that people question about the aggressiveness or relative aggressiveness of these policies or these directions, but it's actually not, we're not unique in this situation. You look at all the jurisdictions that have declared and have set specific goals in achieving decarbonization, these are the things that we need to do. And the question is, how do we do that in the most fair and just way, and in a cost-effective way, and in a reliable way, as now we have seen what has happened in Texas. And then, of course, to do all of these things, we need to minimize the cost by replacing infrastructure as well as equipment when it's time for replacement, so that we're not building up new things that we know we have to replace to achieve the net zero goal in 2050. I have many things to add, but I think I want to just highlight a few things to just get, how do we get there, right? So we actually we have set significant goals about transitioning our transportation system and to transition our heating system. And I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to talk about the implications of that and the policies around that. So maybe I'll just pause there and hand it back to you, Bobbi.
Great. Well, this has given us so much food for thought. And if I could only tell you that I've been looking at the questions in the chat, and you've unleashed a huge number of questions. But I'm going to turn now to Ken, because Ken has worn so many hats as well. And this really leads into the question, as a leader of a major advocacy organization, and being present at the state of Massachusetts when we really made our first forays into this world of green and everything like that. And you were there at the creation. So can you provide us, after hearing all of the things that the Undersecretary just talked about, how can you tell us what are some of the lessons learned? What are the pitfalls? And how do we think of this? Should we think of this as Energy 2.0?
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I did scroll down and saw a lot of attendees that I know and have worked with, so delighted to be with you. And Secretary Chang, I just want to congratulate you and the Baker administration for your leadership. It really has been very, very heartening. And in my most recent hat at UCS, where I was going around the country, it was particularly helpful to be able to talk about a state led by a Republican governor that was making progress on climate, and we should never forget the importance of that. Bobbi, I kind of think about where we're at as Climate 2.0. I was in the Patrick administration when we launched Climate 1.0, which the main ingredients were a large investment in energy efficiency, the beginnings of an effort to wean ourselves off of coal, somewhat using gas as the replacement, but getting our coal consumption down, the beginnings of a renewable policy for solar and offshore wind, and the creation of the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which really links climate and job creation in a way that we're seeing right now with President Biden. I think we really started that. Climate 2.0, and this was an opportunity for Massachusetts to innovate and lead and develop policies that then became replicated elsewhere. I think we're in a similar moment right now. We're in Climate 2.0, where the challenges are going to be focusing particularly on heating and transportation, which are different challenges in many ways than electricity, and continuing in the full decarbonization of the electric grid. So I think we once again have this opportunity at this moment to lead on policy innovation. When I look at the level of ambition in the 2050 roadmap and the 2030 plan and in the legislation, I see that the goals are again ambitious and bold, and I'm glad to see that, with one exception. I still don't know why we haven't committed to 100% clean energy, but that's a different story. But I definitely think that's one area where we haven't gone as far as we could. But the goals are good. I think what's challenging here and what makes Climate 2.0 different from 1.0 is that the policies that we need depend upon millions of people's individual choices about what cars they drive, how they're going to heat their homes. That is a difference between 2.0 and 1.0. And I think where we really need to focus is to develop the policies that will drive that. And I'm not sure that the policies have caught up to the ambition yet. In terms of how to think about that, I want to throw out as an idea that we borrow a page from the playbook of the vaccination effort. When we decided to vaccinate our population, we recognized the key insight that vaccines don't work for anyone unless they work for everyone. And so we're focusing on vaccinating the entire population, and we've chosen various policies to drive that. Well, that needs to be applied to things like electric vehicles. Because of the cost and the convenience issues, there are whole segments of the population right now where EVs are not going to be a feasible choice. And so the policy needs to focus like a laser beam on how you socialize those costs, how you build out an infrastructure that makes electric vehicles, as an example, work for everybody, not just people in the upper half of the income ladder, because if you don't, we just won't succeed. And I have a similar observation on heat pumps. This is what the real challenge of Climate 2.0 is going to be, is to develop a policy that works for millions of people, some of whom are going to face really significant barriers to making the transitions we want them to make. So that's one big piece. The second piece is just to go back to energy a little bit. I think we are in a much better place now on the electric side than we were 10 years ago. We now have the technologies that we need with offshore wind and solar. Coal plants are shutting down. The big challenge, I think, on the electric side is to wean ourselves fully off of natural gas. I think that's going to require not only a huge investment in offshore wind, which we're doing, but a backup source, which seems to me to be staring us in the face. It's pumped hydro, and it's hydro from Canada. And the big challenge for both of these are not so much energy policy as it's siting and permitting. It's the years and years that it's taking for Vineyard Wind to finally complete its permit so it can get built. It's what's happening in Maine right now, where the Clean Energy Connect line has gotten all of its permits and now is going to be subject to a ballot referendum. So we cannot achieve our objectives with this kind of a permitting and siting regime. And I don't have all the answers to it, but I do think some regional level siting agreement where all the different states come up with a plan that does involve stuff getting built in their states and delivering energy from one place to another is going to be absolutely essential. And if we don't do that, all of the policies in place, all of the procurements, they're not going to get built at the time and the scale that we need them to. So I think we're at a really exciting moment. The other big thing we have going for us right now, which is the first, is an administration in Washington that A, really gets it, and B, is prepared to put a lot of money into this. So if we can get the policies right and get the siting and the permitting right, I think there's a huge opportunity ahead to make enormous progress on climate. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Ken. I mean, the comments from both the Undersecretary and from Ken, former DEP commissioner, former general counsel, former president of the Union of Concerned Scientists, are just enormous. And already we have a lot to talk about. So I'm going to turn now to Dr. Reichert, because she has taken an extraordinarily expansive role about innovation. And we just talked about policy and we talked about technology, but really in so many ways, this notion of innovation becomes even doubly important at this moment. And really, I'm just going to turn it over to her to give her own thoughts and respond to some of the comments that she heard. And I will also add another point. In both the Undersecretary and Ken's remarks was the concept of equity, which is very much in there. And we haven't seen that emphasis before in the same way. And I know that also Dr. Reichert has that same perspective in her own work. So I'm just going to turn it over to her, and I'm not going to ask second questions because we have incredible questions in the chat, which we all are dying to answer as well. So Dr. Reichert.
Well, thank you, Bobbi, and thank you to the Environmental League of Massachusetts for hosting me and this conversation, which I think is a very important one. Just off the top, I think the Environmental League of Massachusetts is doing some great work on equity and offshore wind jobs. So I don't know if we'll get a chance to hear about that later, but I just wanted to give them credit where credit is due. It's very exciting work that they're launching in that area. Let me start just by introducing Greentown Labs a bit for those who may not know us. And I think that will feed in nicely to how we think about innovation, which is a very important piece of the puzzle when we're talking about these big goals. 100% renewable energy absolutely should be our aim, but the fact of the matter is we don't have all the technology to get us there yet. And so that needs to be part of the overall solution to climate. So Greentown Labs, we are the largest climate tech incubator in North America, and we're currently a community of more than 100 early stage companies who are tackling challenges across greenhouse gas emitting sectors. And it's not just electricity, it's buildings, transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, and we're seeing an increasing interest and focus in resilience as well. And that's resilience of people and of infrastructure that we need to be planning for, because climate change is already here. Since our founding, we've supported more than 330 startups that are working in this area, and these startups have collectively created more than 6,500 jobs and have raised more than $1.2 billion in capital. And that's generated at least $1.6 billion in regional economic impact for the New England region. Our headquarters, as many of you know, is in Somerville, Massachusetts, right near Tufts, where Bobbi is from, and spans a 100,000 square foot campus. And that makes up prototyping labs, a wet chemistry lab, office, and community space. And some of you may know as well, we will be opening our first ever out-of-state expansion to Houston, Texas on Earth Day, so about 2 weeks away. Houston is the energy capital of the world, and it absolutely needs to be the energy transition capital of the world if we're going to address climate change on the timescale we need to do so. Bobbi mentioned that we think broadly about innovation and climate and energy, and that is absolutely the case. And if I had to say, what is our big picture vision? It's really all about climate impact and how we do that through commercializing new technology that we need to get us there. You may know, and Ken has mentioned, and Judy has mentioned, that we have big goals. Massachusetts and other states and other nations have goals and laws at this point mandating net zero by 2040, 2050, or 2060. But you may not know that we don't have the technology we need to get there yet today. We do have many technologies that we are all familiar with, like solar and wind. These are fully developed and ready to be deployed today. Many others, though, still need to come from laboratories out of our universities and our research labs. An example of that is utility scale energy storage, which we need because wind and solar are intermittent resources. We also need tools for managing our electric grids more efficiently as more renewable energy comes on board. And for offshore wind, which has been mentioned, we need innovations that help keep marine life safe while we do construction and operate wind turbines in our coastal waters. And we need technology to economically capture and reutilize the carbon dioxide that is already in the atmosphere. And we're going to need technology that helps protect and increases the resiliency of people and infrastructure, because climate change is already happening. And of course, we need next generation solar and wind technologies so that we can be making these currently available solutions ever more efficient. So climate impact through innovation, through supporting entrepreneurs developing the innovations that we need and helping them get that technology to scale where it can have an impact on climate change, is really what Greentown Labs does. Because being an entrepreneur is honestly pretty lonely. You're developing a new cutting edge technology and it is really hard. It's hard to develop the technology. You're talking science and engineering problems to be figured out. And it's even tougher to convince someone to fund your technology and the growth of your team and company. And that's why you need an incubator. Our mission is to provide startups with the community resources and connections their companies need to thrive. So an incubator like Greentown Labs brings together a community of entrepreneurs that can support one another. It gathers resources like free software, equipment, and lab space. It provides connections to investors and other partners who can help the startups grow. And it brings a whole ecosystem together around the entrepreneurs that includes professionals in the industry, universities, and NGOs, government agencies, and others who can support the progress of these young companies who have the climate solutions. So incubators are really a place for startups to actualize their prototype, connect with first customers, and begin pilot testing. And this is the stage at which they would tend to come to Greentown Labs and typically stay with us for about 2 years. Now, finally, I'll say that though we are headquartered in the Boston area, I mentioned at the outset of my remarks that we are expanding to Houston, Texas. And that's because there are entrepreneurs across the nation and really around the world that need support to get their innovations to scale where they can have an impact on climate change as quickly as we need to do it. this next decade really matters. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Bobbi, and I know that there's going to be a lot of great questions in the chat, so looking forward to the discussion.
The chat is so rich with questions, and there is absolutely no way we are going to get to them all today. And I've been thinking about how almost I could group some of these questions. So I'm going to start with the issue of several questions, which I'm going to group together. Jobs, racial equity, and general equity. And I'm going to frame them in the question under a concept of participation. And I think that this is a question that I'm actually going to ask each of our panelists from where they sit. How do you sort of prioritize? How do you integrate these three issues? And the other question that Ken brought up was the issue of siting. And siting is connected to everything as well. So I know that you all have thoughts on these issues, and if you could just sort of give us your overview, that would respond to a lot of questions that we're finding in the chat. So I'll start with the Undersecretary and then ask Ken and then Emily, and I'm sure you'll bounce some ideas off each other as well.
Great grouping. I think that is that's a smart way to think about these things, because you're absolutely right that jobs and equity, and in some ways and in many ways participation and siting sort of have their linkages. First of all, I just want to say I think we're in the era of we need to think about climate justice, energy justice, and equity in everything we do. So this is not just about picking certain pieces of the puzzle and or even creating a separate work stream that's called environmental justice, which of course we will put the highlight on them, but everything we do, when we start thinking about future of clean transportation, future of clean heat, and how to plug and play these other parts of the economy to our clean electricity system, the whole picture we need to put at the center of that participation and equity and justice. Because, and in some ways, our energy policies have always tried to take care of low-income communities and low-income ratepayers. But now I think it's grander than that, which is we need to think about listening to people's voices in setting policies and designing programs, because it's a collaborative effort. I don't think any one individual, and certainly sitting at the policy table, we're not experts in understanding everybody's perspective and how a particular policy or program might affect certain people or certain communities. So we're doing everything we can to make sure we integrate that lens in the things that we do. And for example, when we think about providing incentives for electric vehicles, for example, we need to not just think about, okay, well, who's actually buying an electric vehicle? Where do these dollars go? We not only need to think about that, we actually need to go out of the box and say, well, actually what we're really trying to do is remove emissions from the economy, but we're also trying to remove poor air qualities from certain communities that have traditionally borne more of that burden. So how do we create a clean transportation strategy or set incentives in programs so that we target or we make sure that certain communities that have borne those disproportional level of burdens in the past, and how do we correct the wrongs of the past? And I'll just admit that that's not easy. I don't think it's easy. I don't think we know exactly how to best engage with people who want to participate, who have a voice, who want to be heard. I think we're designing that and developing that as we go and try to do better, right? So I think we're all of the agencies together, we're trying to do better. So I just want to maybe just start by saying that I think it's a lens over everything that we're doing.
So I'm going to turn it to Ken, because Ken has sat in a very interesting set of seats in response to your comments. He was in government. He was the subject, and he and I together worked oftentimes facing, opposition and what you're experiencing now as well. But then Ken turned into an advocate. And I wonder, taking your two seats, Ken, as the advocate, and a very forceful advocate and a very strong advocate at the Union of Concerned Scientists, based on what the Undersecretary has said and based on your experience, how do you delve into these issues? I'm just interested to hear what you have to say. We can't hear you. Unmute. Yeah.
It's a great question. I think that my own view of political science has changed because of the era we're in. I used to think that our system was capable of just tackling one problem at a time and would have to put blinders on and focus on that one thing and put all the other stuff aside in order to get something done. I actually think it's completely different now. I think we have 4 overlapping crises. We have the public health crisis of COVID. We have the climate crisis. We have the crisis of racial inequity, and we have a huge economic equality crisis. And I think that the best public policies now, the ones that actually have the best chance of being enacted and implemented, are ones that in one way or another address all of those things. I know from my experience at UCS that the days when largely white-led traditional environmental organizations could think about climate without thinking about environmental justice and climate justice, those days are over. And in fact, we've all come to an agreement with frontline environmental communities embodied in a whole platform about how we're going to go forward in tandem. I think for decision makers, the key thing is to, especially as we're about to make major public investments, is we have to have frontline communities at the table at all levels, shaping what the policies are going to be and who's going to benefit from them. And so I think we absolutely have to put our money where our mouth is. And that's one of the things I'm really excited about ELM's recognizing that we're going to make a big public investment in offshore wind through procurement. We need to make sure that there's significant participation by disadvantaged groups in various ways so that they get a benefit from this. Because if we don't do that, we're just not going to solve the problem at all. And so I think there's a huge role for the advocacy community to insist that all the people who should be at the table are at the table, and that equity is working hand in hand with our climate imperatives so that we do both. And you've said I've worn a bunch of hats. That's true. One of the hats I wear now is I'm a board member of ELM, and I'm very proud of the work that we're doing to integrate equity and racial equality and other considerations into the traditional environmental concerns about clean air and clean water and climate.
So thank you. And I have to now turn to Emily, because Emily is about to take on an enormous challenge. She is taking her incubator to Houston. And I would just love to hear from you, Emily, how in the taking of your clean tech incubator, which you said has to go into the fossil fuel furnace there that you're going into, and then also an area that has such, we all have issues of equity, but just, all the issues of equity with the hurricanes and the ERCOT situation. So how does your incubator play in Houston? And I'm just really interested in your thoughts. And I think that's going to be our close, because we've had such a great conversation that I don't think we'll have time to go on and except thank everyone. And the only other comment is Dennis must be sitting there now himself with all sorts of comments that he would like to make. And we don't have time for an appropriate closing. So Emily, please share your thoughts.
Be happy to. And I'm happy to share thoughts about the Houston context and the Texas context, but I will say that equity is not something that is a Houston or Texas related problem. It is a national and it's an international problem. And certainly we have a lot of issues with Boston and Massachusetts in terms of redlining that has happened for many years. And that is why certain neighborhoods have suffered disproportionately over the growth of our state over time. So just to put that on the table, I think our industry, if I look at it overall, is very challenged. In this last year, we need to think hard about how we do this. And we have a very white, frankly, very male-led industry, generally speaking. And I think in the last year, stemming from the George Floyd murder and the conversation that put on the table, it has been wonderful to see how many voices can be at the table when we start to look for other voices to be there. But we are just so at the beginning of this, and we are so early in understanding how we do this on a sustained basis. And so I know that's something we're thinking about at Greentown Labs, and many organizations in our industry are thinking about, and we need to continue to do that. And it is the work of a lifetime. It's not the work of a post 1 year from George Floyd. So I'll say that right off the top. I do want to say something about Massachusetts before I get to Houston, and that is I am very excited that in the Next Generation Roadmap bill, there was funding for Mass CEC to broaden out its work specifically around workforce development for leaders and entrepreneurs and others who have not traditionally been represented in clean tech and climate tech in Massachusetts. And so that is a very exciting development. And I think that will help. It's certainly not enough, but it's great to have the prolonged focus by programmatic dollars that are now going to be part of Mass CEC's ongoing budget. Now, as we think about where we're going at Greentown, we really think of kind of two streams of inclusion in the industry that needs to happen. So one is certainly what I've just been talking about, which is the opportunity for everyone to be part of the climate tech revolution who perhaps have not been at the table, who have not benefited from the technologies that are developed specifically for people who can afford a Tesla. There's that piece of it. And like I said, I think the Mass CEC funds will start to address at least the workforce piece of that, but we need to do a heck of a lot more. There's also the piece of all of the workers, and this is specific to the Houston context, who are currently in the traditional energy industry, who are now looking at the disappearing of their livelihoods in the next 10 to 12 years, or perhaps 10 to 20 years. People will tell you there's still oil and gas happening, that we're still going to need it for cars, et cetera. But people are scared. And I think that's what we miss when we just say the fossil fuel industry is evil, or, we just kind of very quickly, black and white, say something like that. These are people that have been through Hurricane Harvey, 50 inches of rain in 2 days. Climate change is a very real thing for people in Houston, Texas. And so I think that you have to think about this in the context of how do we include everyone, people that have been in the traditional oil and gas industry, people that have not been in the energy industry at all, and make this set of opportunities, which is so huge. We have to decarbonize all of the sectors of our economy. There should be jobs enough for everyone in that. And so when we think about the Houston and the Boston context, that's what we're thinking about. How do you bring entrepreneurs from wherever they are coming from, whether it's from the industry as it is today, or people that could have the opportunity to be part of the industry of the future and should be part of that. We have to think of how we get everyone on board, all hands on deck when we're thinking about the climate crisis and the challenges that we need to really deal with around innovation for climate change and resiliency of people and infrastructure. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Emily. And I just think that the notion of STEM and technology and engaging the whole workforce on that level as well. Well, I think this session has been quite amazing. We've touched on a lot of issues that really ELM has given us the opportunity. And we also want to thank the sponsor. Don't forget to register for next Thursday's session, where we're going to talk more about the issue of climate and equity that we just touched upon in our session. And thank you, and be well, and for a very enlightening panel. Thank you, everybody.